For today's video, we're going to see how far into Chapter 9 we can get. Theoretically, we can wrap up the chapter, but I'm going to keep an eye on our time just so that we don't run over the standard 80-minute mark for class. But Chapter 9 is going to be all about the extinction of conditioned behavior. Now, this is kind of weird because up to this point in the course, we've focused pretty much exclusively on how we can get behavior to happen. How can we make things happen more frequently? How are we getting things to occur? But now we're going to talk about the other side of things. How do we get things to stop happening? How do we make a conditioned behavior less likely to occur? Hence extinction. We'll find that some of the topics that we're going to cover are going to be a little bit similar to something like habituation, but we're going to mention that as we go along. But our basic path for today is that we're going to talk about effects of extinction procedures and different types of recovery from extinction, and then we're going to move on into focusing how we can actually enhance extinction. How do we make it more likely to work better? So first step is, what is extinction? As I kind of alluded to on that title slide, extinction is when we're trying to reduce the occurrence of some kind of conditioned behavior. Now, because of that idea, we can only use extinction after either classical or instrumental conditioning has occurred. As a bit of a refresher, for classical conditioning, we have our conditioned stimulus that we would pair with an unconditioned stimulus, and we would get an increase in responding to that conditioned stimulus. So we get our conditioned responding increases. For instrumental conditioning, a response leads to a reinforcer, and because of something about that relationship, we get an increase in responding. So in both cases, that increase in responding is what we're trying to counteract with extinction. So on paper, the goal is to try and reverse the effects of acquisition. The problem here is that we're not actually erasing earlier learning. Even though extinction is sort of the exact opposite direction of acquisition, where we're having a reduction in that learned behavior, and even though on paper we're trying to reverse those effects, it isn't a straight one-to-one reversal. It isn't opposite acquisition. Extinction isn't the same thing as acquisition, but in the backwards direction. What we find again and again is that extinction is new learning. So we're not erasing the earlier learning, we are learning a new association that sometimes can override previous learning. So this whole chapter is effectively going to be us driving home the fact that extinction is new learning. It's not unlearning, it's just learning something else. And we're going to discuss things like spontaneous recovery, renewal, reinstatement, and resurgence, all concepts that show us that extinction isn't unlearning, that it is in fact this new learning. So, okay, that's kind of what extinction is and a lot of what it isn't. Let's go into a little bit more detail about how we can physically do extinction, what's involved in this process. In simplest terms, extinction is just the removal of one of the stimuli that's involved in having that increase in responding occur. So if we look at classical conditioning, extinction for classical conditioning would involve repeated presentations of our conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus present. So by removing that unconditioned stimulus, we can see the conditioned stimulus on its own without the unconditioned stimulus that it had been previously associated with. In instrumental conditioning, extinction involves no longer presenting the reinforcer when the response happens. So even though the behavior, the response is occurring, there is no reinforcer afterwards. So in both cases, one of those elements of that setup has been removed, and our outcome should be that there is a decline in our conditioned responding. Now we can take another brief detour into something that extinction is not, and extinction is not forgetting. They're very different concepts here. So with forgetting, behavior changes because of a passage of time. So as time goes on, the connections or the associations that were made between different stimuli gets weaker and weaker until they go away. But with extinction, this is occurring because of experience. This change in behavior, this change in responding is occurring because of experience, because we're learning something new. So forgetting is more of a over long periods of time, and it's a fairly passive process, whereas extinction is an active process where we are actively learning something new. So let's take a moment and let's go over an example of extinction occurring that you might have seen in your everyday lives. So we have a vending machine, and imagine that you go up to the vending machine, you put your money in, and you press a button, but nothing happens. Okay, what do you do next? This vending machine, this situation hasn't worked in the way that you would normally expect it. In a normal situation, you walk up to the vending machine, you put your money in, you press the button, and you get the thing that you have requested. You usually perform the behaviors and get your reinforcer, the food that you asked for. But in this new scenario that we're talking about, nothing happens. There's no reinforcer delivered, you don't get the food you asked for. So what do? Well, usually what people will do is that they'll press the button again harder. They'll press it repeatedly. Maybe they're going to shake the machine a little bit. Maybe they try and press a different button. Maybe they're going to push harder on different buttons. Maybe they're going to start requesting their money back. They're going to start doing lots and lots of different behaviors. And if none of those work, if nothing happens, eventually you're going to get tired, you're going to get bored, and you're just going to walk away. So this could be an example of extinction because, well, you did the behavior that you usually do, and instead of getting that reinforcer of the food that you requested, you got nothing. We do see that spike in different behaviors. We see some variable behavior where you're trying different buttons, you're pushing the buttons differently, but eventually you're going to walk away. And if this continued, if this was a regular thing where this vending machine didn't work, maybe the next day you try it again. You go back and you say, well, maybe I'll see if it works today. If it still doesn't work, you might stop using that vending machine. You would stop your response of putting money into that machine and pressing buttons because you no longer expect to get food out of it. So you've learned something new, that this vending machine doesn't work and you shouldn't use it. So that situation actually sums up a lot of the characteristics of extinction that we're going to be talking about today, including our extinction burst, where we see more activity or even anger towards this thing when we're not getting reinforced like we should be, trying different behaviors, and then eventually giving up, and then eventually stopping that behavior altogether. And even the occurrence of, well, maybe if I try it again later, it might work then. That could be equivalent to something like spontaneous recovery. So keep this example in the back of your minds as we work through the rest of the chapter. So let's do an official summary of the effects of extinction procedures and apply what we just talked about in terms of our example. So there are two major things that we tend to see with extinction procedures. The first is probably the most obvious and the most well-studied of these effects, and this is that the target response decreases when it no longer results in reinforcement. Basically, when doing that response, when having the behavior occur doesn't lead to reinforcement, you're going to do less and less of that behavior. That's pretty much the definition of the extinction process, so of course that makes sense. We're going to see less responding because of that extinction process. The second part is that we do see an increase in response variability, at least at first. So right off the bat, when the machine wouldn't take our money and give us the food that we wanted, we would try different responses, hit different buttons, hit the same buttons in a different way, shake the machine. Those are all instances of response variability. You're doing slightly different responses to see if any of those can work instead. And this process, having a decrease in responding and an increase in variability when you are responding, is well illustrated by a study by Neuringer done back in 2001, where they were looking specifically at response variability. Okay, so let's set the stage here. Our subjects are rats, pretty standard, rats in an operant box. We've seen this before. In the setup that we have is that in our operant box here, we have two levers and a key. So I think that they said that there are two levers on one wall, one on the left, one on the right, and then there's a key or a button on another wall. So there are three possible responses that can be made. So you can press the left lever, you can press the right lever, or you can push the key. And in this setup, the rats have to make 3 responses in a row to receive food. And we have 2 different groups, and these groups have different restrictions on what kinds of responses that they can give. So group 1 was reinforced for variability. They had to vary their pattern of responding. So for group 1, if they pressed the left lever 3 times on trial 1, then on trial 2, they couldn't do that again. They'd have to try a different combination. So then maybe trial 2, they would press the left lever once and then the key twice, and then they would get reinforcement. And then the next time they'd have to try something else again. So we've seen this before where they're being reinforced for variability, for novel responses. And so we can expect that this group would show an increase in their response variability, because that's what they're being reinforced for. Group 2, which they also call the yoked group, they basically could get the response, or they could get reinforcement for any combination of responses. There was no variation required. This was our control group. They could kind of do whatever. They could hit this lever 3 times and they would get reinforcement. And they could do that every single time and still get reinforcement. So that's our setup. We have one group that's been reinforced for variability and one group that's been reinforced with no restrictions on their variability. So let's look at what their data looked like. So this diagram here, we're looking specifically at rate of responding. So how quickly are they pressing their levers? And so we have the squares are our control group and our circles are our variability group. And so we can see that our control group is responding just a little bit faster than the variability group. And that kind of makes sense. If the levers are all spread out across this box, then the variability group probably has to move a little bit more in between presses to be able to press different combinations. So they're probably a little bit slower, which would result in a lower rate of responding. So that kind of makes sense. During our reinforcement stage, we see that they're pressing the lever and key in whatever combination they're pressing fairly frequently. So we're seeing about 7 to 9 trials per minute seems to be pretty average, and it's fairly stable. Cool. That's as we would expect. When we enter extinction, then we see a pretty dramatic drop-off in their responding. So at the beginning of this extinction setup, then we're going to see that, they are both showing a drop in responding. And in the first session, it's a slight drop from what they were at when they were being reinforced. In the second session, it's an even bigger drop. And eventually they're down to very, very low rates of responding. So after those 4 sessions, they've stabilized at very low rates of responding. When we go back into a reinforcement setup, once they reintroduce our reinforcement contingencies, we go back up to fairly high rates of responding. And when we go back to extinction, our rates of responding drop off again. So this shows us that number 1 on our list, that there is a decrease in overall responding for both groups. Cool. As expected. Where it starts getting really cool is when we look at response variability. So same basic setup, but this time instead of just looking at how much responding they're doing per unit time, now we're looking at, basically this is a weird measure of variability. So higher on this axis means more variation in their responses, and lower means less variation. So obviously our control group has very low variability here. And that's because they weren't being reinforced for variability. But our variability group is very high because that's what they were being reinforced for. It makes sense. But what happens when we go into extinction? This is where it's really cool. So despite the fact that their overall rate of responding has decreased, the responses that they are making are more variable. We're seeing a lot more creativity or variability in the combinations of buttons and levers that they're pressing when they hit extinction here. And so if you look, our variability group here shows an increase in variability even above what they had been showing during training. So they're showing a slight increase here, and our control group shows a increase in their variability as well. So it doesn't matter if you were trained to be variable or not, you're still going to see in both of those groups an increase in response variability during extinction. And again, really, really cool, when we go back to reinforcement, they drop back down to the levels that are required by their different restrictions, but no more. So that increase in variability isn't permanent. It only happens when the extinction contingency is in place, which is just really cool. So this shows us our decrease in target response when it no longer results in reinforcement, and an increase in response variability, at least at first. So if we did this for a long, long period of time, if we continued this forever, this line might sort of slowly drop off. But that's not what this study was looking at. We do have a third effect that we might see, and this is the idea of frustration. So this is an aversive emotional reaction that results from the unexpected absence of a reinforcer. So this might induce aggression. In a very anthropomorphic view, this would be the idea of a rat expected to be getting food, and when they don't get food, they get mad about it, and they might lash out. So we can see frustration in terms of aggressive responses, and these responses can be fairly intense. If we think back to our vending machine problem earlier on, if you've ever watched someone who's had a vending machine eat their money or not give them their food or whatever, if they start shouting at it or violently shaking it, that would be an instance of frustration. And this has been shown in a variety of animals. We're going to keep on with our trend of rats, but it's been seen in pigeons and humans and all sorts of different species as well. So let's take a look at an experiment that actually shows this frustration or aggression that can come from extinction procedures. So this is by Tomei et al. In 1993. So a little bit further back, and again, still looking at rats, and in this case, we are going to start with rats that are water deprived. And there are 4 phases in this experiment. For phase 1, we saw an alternating schedule of either 3 minutes with a variable interval of 30 seconds for water delivery, so basically every 30 seconds, more or less, that's what the variable part of that means. Every 30 seconds on average, the rat would receive access to water, and then that would be followed by 3 minutes of no water, so an extinction period, and this was signaled by a tone. So we introduce an S- that means no water. So that tone tells us that water will not be delivered. Whenever that tone isn't present, then water is delivered on that 30-second variable interval schedule, but whenever the tone is present, there's no water. Phase 2, there would be no delivery of water no matter what. Whether there was a tone or no tone present, both conditions, they get no water. Phase 3 was the same as phase 1, where we have sometimes water is delivered and sometimes there's a tone telling them that extinction is going on and that they won't get water. And then phase 4 is actually the opposite of phase 2. Phase 4 is that there's no tone and tone both mean water. So in phase 2, they always get no water, and in phase 4, they just always get water. So we can kind of look at phase 1 and phase 3 are identical, so we should expect very similar results. And phase 2 and phase 4 are opposites, so we should look at what those two look like in comparison to one another. Okay, and what are we measuring in this experiment? What we're going to focus on is a behavioral measure, which is target bar bites. Basically, they had a plexiglass bar wrapped in tape, and biting that target would be a sign of frustration in rats. So the expectation here is that they should bite that bar whenever they're experiencing extinction. So let's see if that's what we actually observe. So in phase 1, as a reminder, anytime that the tone was present, there was no water present. So tones are open squares. No tone is closed circle. So open square means no water, means extinction. Closed circle means they got water, which means a normal trial. And so this graph is showing us mean target bites per session, where a higher score here means they're showing more measures of frustration. And this is just our time interval. And so we can see that very, very quickly, the no tone, the normal trials where they got water, stayed pretty low. They tend not to bite that bar when they're getting water. But when our tone sessions played, when they're in extinction and they're not getting access to water, we see increasing aggression and frustration as they bite that bar. Now, we can kind of condense that this whole graph here. So this was for phase 1. We'd see something very, very similar for phase 3 as well. But we're looking at sort of the difference between aggression when there's a tone present versus aggression when there's no tone present. And we can bring that over here where we've averaged across session or phase 1 across multiple sessions, and we're looking at their average bites per session. So for phase 1, we have very low bites when there was no tone present. So when they were getting water, there was low aggression. When they weren't getting water, when the tone played, they were very aggressive. And so for phase 1 and phase 3, we see that separation where lots of aggression when the tone was playing to let them know that extinction was happening and that they weren't getting access to water. But when they got their water, when everything went as planned, there was low levels of aggression. Makes sense. Okay, what about phase 2 and phase 4? Phase 2 was where, whether there was a tone or not, they were getting no water. And we see that there's actually very low levels of aggression here. So by removing that differential contingency, where sometimes it's reinforced and sometimes it isn't reinforced, where we remove that uncertainty, in other words, then we don't see those frustration effects. We don't see one instance giving frustration and one being not. We just see that both are fairly low here in terms of frustration because there's low levels of aggression. And for more evidence of that, with phase 4, where water is given for both tones and no tones, even though it's the opposite of phase 2, where they didn't get water in either situation. Now they get water in both situations, and they're still showing no aggression or very, very low levels of aggression. So this is telling us that frustration comes from this differential scheduling of reinforcement here, where they get reinforcement sometimes and extinction other times. That unexpected extinction is what's driving this frustration. And if we remove that unexpected nature, we tend to see a lot less frustration, and we don't see a difference here because it doesn't matter if the tone is present or absent, you're still not getting water. So yeah, just more evidence that we need that difference in expectations or difference in reinforcement conditions in order to see that frustration present. Okay, so we've kind of established ourselves within the idea of extinction and what it kind of looks like and what it can lead to. So now let's see some of the evidence that we have that tells us why extinction is not unlearning. So we've made this statement multiple times now that extinction does not reverse or undo original learning. It isn't the opposite or unraveling of our associations. In fact, we are learning something new. But how do we know this? And I mentioned at the very beginning that we have 4 key situations that show us that extinction is novel learning, that it's new learning in addition to what was learned previously. So we're going to look at all 4 of these one at a time to show lots of evidence that extinction is different and is sort of new learning as opposed to just undoing what we learned previously. So let's start off with spontaneous recovery. And this is something that we've already talked about as it relates to habituation, where I think very early on in the course, we would have mentioned habituation of, say we have a very loud sound playing, and when that sound goes off, then a rat would show a startle response. But as that sound happens more and more frequently, we see less and less of a startle response until there's pretty much no response to that loud sound playing. But if we wait a period of time, maybe the next day you come back and play that loud sound again, you'll see a startle response happen again. It won't be as intense as the first startle response, and it will go away a lot faster, but that habituation process also shows spontaneous recovery. So same basic idea, but now we're going to be applying this spontaneous recovery to either conditioned responding or operant responding. So it works for all of those instances. So here we have the same thing that I just verbally described, but this time we're looking at an instance of classical conditioning. So at the beginning, we would have acquisition. So here we're looking at our behavioral measure being saliva elicited by our conditioned stimulus. So let's talk about dogs salivating to the sound of a bell. At the very beginning, when you sound a bell, a dog doesn't salivate. They don't have any association between that bell and anything that would make them salivate, so there's low levels of salivation. But as we go through this acquisition stage, as we pair, say, food, our unconditioned stimulus, with our bell, the conditioned stimulus, we'll see more and more saliva produced when they hear the bell because now they associate the bell with getting food. We can then go through extinction, where we present our conditioned stimulus alone. So we ring the bell, but we don't give them food. Over time, they learn that the bell no longer means that I'm getting food, and so we see a drop-off in salivation. So they no longer have the same response because they've learned that the conditioned stimulus alone no longer means that they're always going to get food. Then if we have these 24-hour rest periods, so we take a little bit of a break, come back the next day, we'll see what's called spontaneous recovery. And this is the first time it's occurring, so it's going to be not as intense as right after acquisition happened, but we are still going to see an increase in that salivation response when our conditioned stimulus is presented, even though the conditioned stimulus is being presented in extinction, meaning it's not being followed by our unconditioned stimulus again. It's just the bell, there's no food, and we see that salivation response drop fairly quickly, but there was still that spontaneous recovery here. For the next day, again, 24 hours later, we'd see again just a little bit of a spontaneous recovery instance here, and it would drop off very quickly. But the more times that this is presented in extinction, the smaller and smaller that spontaneous recovery bump will be each time. So instead of our vague data from here, let's look at a specific experiment that actually looked at this. So again, back in the 90s, we're going to look at Rescorla. That Rescorla from Rescorla-Wagner model was looking at goal tracking in rats. So basically, how often do they poke their nose into the feeder? So the idea here is that if they anticipate that a particular conditioned stimulus is associated with the delivery of food, we should see them poke their noses into the feeder more often whenever that conditioned stimulus plays. So just like dogs associating a bell with food and salivating, rats that associate a bell with food might put their heads into their feeders where they would expect to be receiving food. So we had a bunch of different groups, 3 different groups that were all given full conditioning setups and then followed by full extinction. So they were all trained to associate a particular condition stimulus with getting food, and then they entered into extinction, and a full extinction session would be to get down to very, very low levels of responding. They could set their own criteria. Maybe it's no responding, maybe it's only 10% responding, whatever it is. They wanted all groups to get down to those very low levels of responding following extinction. And then in our 3 groups, 2 of them were proper experimental groups where they went through this full conditioning and full extinction. The rest, or CS rest group, they were tested 8 days after extinction. So let me grab my pen here. So they would have gone through their acquisition phase. They would have then gone into extinction phase. And then there is an 8-day gap before they're tested again. So you can imagine it would probably look something like this. Whereas our no rest group, the test session happened immediately after extinction. So these guys had their acquisition phase, they then went through extinction, and then they were tested immediately after extinction. So if there isn't a break here, if there isn't a delay, you might predict that they would continue responding with the same level of response that they had at the end of extinction, because there is no delay. So this is going to show us, sort of spoilers, that on the next page, that this gap, this delay, is very, very important. We'd also have a preconditioned stimulus group. This is just a control group that received no training. So it's how often do rats poke their heads into feeders when they've not been told that a particular sound or stimulus is associated with getting food. So our 3rd group is just a blind control. All right. And so if we're going to orient ourselves on this graph here, we're looking at mean magazine entries per minute. So how often are the rats poking their heads into the feeder across number of test trials? So we have our CS rest condition. Those are the ones that had an 8-day gap before they were tested. We have our CS no rest, these guys down here, which were tested immediately after extinction. And then our pre-CS is just the control group. So let's look at the control group first, because that's the easiest. They have very low levels of sticking their head into the feeder, and that is perfectly fine because they were never taught to associate a particular stimulus with getting food from that feeder. So this is just our background level of feeder approaches from those rats, which should be very low. For our no rest group, for the group that was tested right after extinction, they continued responding at very, very low rates. These open circles are still very, very low. So this is telling us that because they had just finished extinction, they still knew that they shouldn't respond to that conditioned stimulus. However, if we look at our CS rest group, this is the group that had that delay, we see spontaneous recovery where they're responding, where their number of magazine entries increases dramatically after that rest period. So we see that they're showing a response to that conditioned stimulus, so we see spontaneous recovery. So this tells us that that rest period is very, very important, where during that period, something happens that makes this spontaneous recovery possible. Now, if extinction was unlearning of what was originally acquired, then we wouldn't expect to see spontaneous recovery. We wouldn't expect any difference in responding between a group that was tested after arrest versus immediately after extinction. If extinction was just unlearning what had been originally learned, then these 2 groups would both look identical and they would both be very flat at the bottom. But because we see this spontaneous recovery, we know that this group hasn't unlearned what happened. It hasn't unlearned what was acquired. They had just learned something new, that through extinction, the conditioned stimulus was at that moment no longer associated with getting food. But what they originally learned is still there behind the scenes. All right, so that's our spontaneous recovery. Let's look at renewal. So number 2 here. And renewal is going to be specifically the renewal of our original excitatory conditioning. So this happens when we see an increase in behavior when our contextual cues that were present during extinction are changed. So specifically, this is telling us that as we move away from what we experienced during extinction, as the environment changes or as the stimuli that are present change, then we'll see that behavior return, and the extinction is less and less effective as these cues change. So typically in renewal experiments, acquisition will occur in one context, usually just called context A, and extinction training occurs in context B, which is just a second context. And so if you remove that individual from context B, maybe you bring them back to context A, or you bring them to a new context, which is context C, then you tend to see a reappearance of that conditioned responding. So that tells us that that conditioned responding, or that reduction in conditioned responding, is specific to the context in which it was taught. So we only see that decrease in context B, where it was originally trained, where it was originally going through that extinction. Now, this is super important, especially in terms of practical applications, because if you're doing something like therapy research, this would tell you that improvements that occur in, say, a therapist's office might not hold as soon as the client leaves that office. So if they return to a different environment, the problem behaviors that were being trained away might come back because they're now in another environment. So they've left context B, and now the extinction no longer holds. So as per usual, let's look at an experiment that actually studied this so we can see it play out. So this experiment was done in the 80s by Booten and King, and this is just a renewal of fear experiment. So they started off in context A, where they went through fear conditioning. So they paired a tone, our conditioned stimulus, with a foot shock being our unconditioned stimulus, in context A. So this is context A. We're going to have a visual representation of it. They could then have two different groups here. So half of them received extinction in context A, so they weren't brought anywhere else. They stayed in the location where they originally were conditioned for that fear response. But half of the rats were brought to context B, so a new location. So half of them experienced extinction only in this new location. For testing, they were then brought back to context A, or in this group here, they stayed in context A, and they were tested. So what happens when this tone plays in context A? So we might expect this group at the top, where they went through extinction in context A, they had no fear response. The extinction and the training in this specific context taught them that that tone in this context didn't mean foot shock any longer, so they showed no fear response. However, the group that received their extinction training in a different context, in context B, when they were tested with that tone back in context A, they showed a fear response. So what they had learned about extinction of that tone and the foot shock didn't generalize to other contexts. It only held for them in context B. So because they hadn't learned anything about that fear conditioning being extinguished in context A, they were still expecting a foot shock in context A, so they showed that fear response. And so we can look at a graph of this data where we have our, this is a suppression ratio, which is basically how much are they suppressing a response. In this case, we're just looking at lever pressing. So the less they press a lever, the more they are suppressing their behavior. So the idea here is that if a rat is showing a fear response, they're not going to be doing other behaviors. They tend to freeze and hold still. So scoring very low here means that they are more afraid and showing less behavior. So at the beginning here, this is when they're going through their acquisition. So at the very beginning, after acquisition, they would show lots of freezing responses because they don't want to move because they're expecting to get a foot shock. So from this point onward is when they would go through extinction training. And so our solid dots here are for the group that would have stayed in A. So they went through extinction training in A, and they were then tested in A. Our open circles are the second group. These are the ones that went through extinction training in condition B or context B. So that's this house here. So these guys went through their extinction training in a second environment. And so in both of these, we're measuring how much are they suppressing their behavior, how much of a fear response are they showing when they're doing their extinction training. So dark circles, we're testing this in A. Open circles, this is being looked at in B. And for both of them, we see a pretty decent extinction curve. So this is the opposite of what we've expected. So our usual graph looks kind of like this, where we have acquisition and then extinction. This is just the mirror of that, where our acquisition would have been, nope, I'm drawing it exactly the same way again. Here we go. Our acquisition would be a sort of increase in suppression. So it would look like this. That would be our acquisition phase. So this is like the most fear responding. And then as we go through extinction, we're getting back up to less and less suppression or less and less fear. So it's just the opposite of what we've been seeing so far. I find it frustrating that they use graphs that show the opposite direction. It's just we're looking at the inverse for whatever reason. But yeah, so normal extinction graphs here. So they're both experiencing extinction. And then when we're testing, we're back in condition A or context A. So back to the blue house. And so for the group that was in the blue house and experienced extinction in the blue house, they continue to show pretty high suppression here. So they're not freezing a lot. They're not showing that fear response. Because of this extinction, they're still pushing the lever pretty often. They're not showing lots of freezing and fear. For the ones that were experiencing extinction in context B, are open circles. When they're brought back to A and tested here, we see that they go right back to very high levels of freezing. There's a lot of a fear response here. And then as they're experiencing that tone in the testing condition, so back in environment A, they're experiencing that tone without getting a shock afterwards. They slowly start showing some more of that sort of, I guess, slowly showing less fear responses, showing less freezing to get back up to normal levels. And then here we also have NE is just a control group. So this group just didn't undergo extinction training. So they were given acquisition and then they were tested again. So there was no extinction there, which is why their freezing behavior stays fairly high. They show a lot of fear because they never went through extinction. But our group B is the one that's really important here, where the extinction from context B, from this other house, didn't transfer over, and so they showed fear here before then slowly showing less and less fear. This would effectively be a second extinction procedure because it's being presented, the conditioned stimulus, without being followed by a shock, which is why that one's rising. But yeah, so this tells us that our extinction training doesn't transfer out of the conditions in which it was originally being trained. So this extinction training was specific to context B, and so it didn't really help them in context A because they weren't taught in context A. Okay, and this is just sort of the exact same information. I think I explained all of that, so we don't need to go over that again. All right, so that is spontaneous recovery. That is renewal. What about reinstatement? So reinstatement is the recovery of a conditioned behavior that's produced by exposure to our unconditioned stimulus. So an example of this would be, say that Mary is afraid of dogs, and she successfully completes exposure therapy and her fear of dogs is extinguished. She's able to go places where there are dogs and she doesn't feel afraid. But then one day she goes to the park and she gets bit by a dog. And now that she's had exposure to that unconditioned stimulus again, she'll probably have a recovery in her fear, in her conditioned response. It's going to come back because now she's been re-exposed to that unconditioned stimulus. So the next time that she goes somewhere that has a dog, that conditioned stimulus, she's probably going to be afraid. So that conditioned behavior of showing fear will recover and reoccur because she was exposed to that unconditioned stimulus. And so if you remember, extinction is specifically exposure to our conditioned stimulus without having our unconditioned stimulus present. So our exposure training would be lots and lots of conditioned stimulus all on its own. And so because Mary got used to seeing dogs without getting bit, she was able to get rid of that conditioned response of being afraid. But when she was reintroduced to our unconditioned stimulus, as soon as we added that back into the situation, she gets bit by a dog, then our conditioned response comes back. So it kind of reinstates what had been what had been counteracted by our extinction. So we're showing that, this unconditioned stimulus can still happen, so our conditioned response comes back. So let's look at another example to try and make this a little bit more clear. So we're going to look at an experiment that was studying reinstatement of fear in humans. So this was done in 2005. And this is going to be fairly similar to what we just saw with rats being trained in different conditions. But we're going to have, at the very beginning, we're looking at fear conditioning to a blue square on a computer screen. So at the very beginning, we'd show our conditioned stimulus, which is just a blue square on a computer screen, and get the participants used to that happening. So for that habituation phase, we're just showing them a blue square on a screen. Conditioned stimulus is there, but it's fine. There's no unconditioned stimulus at this point. It's just a blue square on a screen. Then we move into our acquisition phase. And now our blue square that's on the screen is followed at the very end by a loud burst of noise. That's our unconditioned stimulus. So when that blue square pops up on the screen, when it's been up for a few minutes before, or for a few seconds before it disappears, there's a loud burst of noise. And what they're going to measure here is skin conductance. Basically, when you have a fear response, you tend to sweat just a little bit. So the conductivity of your skin gets higher, so we can measure when you're having a fear response. Okay, so that acquisition or fear conditioning phase all happened in one room. This time, slightly different from our rats on the previous slides, now our extinction is going to happen in that same room. So we're still in context A here, and all of our groups will go through extinction in the same room where they experience their fear conditioning. And so here, extinction is the presentation of our conditioned stimulus, our blue square, but now without the unconditioned stimulus. So there's no loud, scary noise afterwards. So they should get used to seeing the square without expecting loud noises again. So that's our extinction process. All right, next we're going to go through reinstatement. So what's happening here is there's a little bit of a delay where some of the participants were going to be remaining in condition A or in room A, but half of the participants were moved to a different location. They were moved to context B, which is a different room. So these lines are just saying that some of the participants were moved, so there was a little bit of a break. So habituation, acquisition, and extinction all happened fairly quickly and close together, but there was a little bit of a break here, just so that you know what's going on. And so what happens here is that the participants, either in room A or room B, weren't shown our conditioned stimulus. That isn't involved at all. All they did was get exposure to our unconditioned stimulus. So there would be a burst of noise, the same noise from before, in either room A or room B. So after they had been re-exposed to that unconditioned stimulus, they would be brought back to condition A, to the first room that they were in, and they were tested with our conditioned stimulus. So they were shown the blue square on the screen. So it's like, okay, what will we expect here? And so what we might expect is that because they went through, let's look at the group on the bottom. This group on the bottom went through extinction in the context where they had originally been. Then they went somewhere else and heard that scary sound somewhere else, and then returned to a room that they had been taught was safe. They didn't show any fear response. Their skin conductivity didn't rise because they had learned that this room was safe, and their re-exposure to that unconditioned stimulus happened elsewhere. But in the group that stayed in room A, so even though they were taught here that room A is safe, the exposure to that unconditioned stimulus again in that same space showed them that maybe it isn't as safe as you thought, and we see recovery of fear, where when they have that conditioned stimulus shown to them in this room, because of this presentation of the unconditioned stimulus in that same room, they showed a fear response. So just seeing that square again made them show an increase in skin conductance. So this tells us that we're seeing a reinstatement effect, and it's context specific. So where that reinstatement occurred, whether it's in the same or a different location, affects what we observe at the outcome. So this idea of what you're exposed to and when could be applied, especially in terms of things like relapse, if you're looking at, say, drug addiction or something like that. So something good to keep in mind. And there's been quite a bit of research looking at the reinstatement effects here. All right, so that's spontaneous recovery, renewal, reinstatement. What's our last one? Let's talk about resurgence. So resurgence is the reappearance of an extinguished response caused by the extinction of another behavior. Now, this is a new situation. All of the other ones that we've talked about have been specific to sort of one behavior. We've been looking at one particular behavioral response. But resurgence is looking at multiple behaviors. For sake of ease, we're probably just going to look at 2 behaviors at a time, but this kind of makes sense because in the real world, behaviors don't occur in isolation. You don't have just one possible behavioral response. There can be multiple. Things get complicated. So resurgence is a sort of newer aspect of research where we're starting to look at multiple different behaviors that could occur. And so the idea here is that if one behavior, say behavior A, had been extinguished, and then there's another behavior that was allowed to continue, but when that second behavior, behavior B, is extinguished, then we might see a reoccurrence of behavior A because of the extinction of behavior B. So getting rid of our second option might cause people to go back to doing the first option. As per usual, let's look at an example where actual research had looked at resurgence. So in this example, we're going to look at rats in an operant box where they have 2 possible levers, lever 1 and lever 2. So during all of this, lever 1 is never reinforced. So that's what the L1 minus means. It means that pressing lever 1 never resulted in getting access to food. And so at the very beginning here, we can see that over time, when pressing lever 1 doesn't result in getting food, we see a decrease in responding to lever 1. So that's pretty much extinction, right? So you don't get food for pressing lever 1, so you push lever 1 less and less and less. Then we enter a new stage where lever 1 is still not being reinforced. It's still L1 minus, but we introduce that lever 2 can get you reinforcement. So the idea here is that if you press lever 2, you will get food. And so because lever 1 is still not being reinforced, our pressing of lever 1 stays fairly low. Then we enter stage 3, where lever 2 is now put on extinction. So in phase 1 and phase 2, lever 1 never gave reinforcement, so rates of responding stayed fairly low. But when we started to put lever 2 through extinction, the rats tried a different behavior. They went back to pressing lever 1. So our rates of responding went back up again. We see a resurgence of this behavior despite the fact that lever 1 is still not being reinforced, and it never was during all of this process. So the change in the response contingencies of lever 2, meaning that when lever 2 went from being reinforced to not reinforced, that's what drove this resurgence of responding to lever 1. So because lever 2 went through extinction, we start seeing more responding to lever 1. Okay, so all of those show us that extinction is not going back on or undoing previous learning. So extinction's not eliminating prior learning, it's not undoing acquisition, none of that. Extinction is new learning. And we know this because behaviors can reappear if there's a passage of time. So we'll experience spontaneous recovery if a certain amount of time passes and then we are re-exposed to one of those stimuli. We can see the behavior reappear if the context changes. So we have renewal when the context changes. We can see that behavior reappear if we get re-exposed to our unconditioned stimulus. So we have reinstatement. Or if we experience extinction of another response, we can experience resurgence. So those are the 4 key pieces of evidence that we have showing that extinction is new learning. Okay, now that we've hopefully drilled that home, let's start talking about techniques that we can use to minimize this return of extinguished learning. How can we prevent this reappearing of behavior that we tried to extinguish? For terms of application, why might we want more effective extinction? An obvious answer would be therapy. If you're trying to get someone to get over, say, a fear of something or a phobia of something, or if you want to get them to stop doing a particular behavioral response, then extinction is the exact opposite of what you're aiming for. So if we can try and minimize these reoccurrences of that behavior, then we can have more effective extinction, which means more effective therapeutic applications. Okay, so what are we going to cover? We're going to hit 3 major techniques for enhancing extinction. So first, we're going to talk about having a greater number of trials. Next, we're going to talk about how those trials are delivered, so massing and spacing. And then we want to try getting rid of that spontaneous recovery. How can we adjust things to try and get rid of spontaneous recovery, which is usually just many, many repetitions. And it's actually occurring to me, I was going to break these down onto their own slides, but then I realized that they are fairly conceptually concise, so I don't think we have to break them down. So I am actually just going to keep talking about them in more detail here. Okay, so back to the top. Greater number of trials. That one is actually pretty self-explanatory. When you're putting an individual through extinction, the more exposure to that extinction contingency, the more likely it is that that extinction is going to be learned. So if you have more extinction trials, more exposures to the conditioned stimulus in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus, or the more exposure to the more times a behavior can occur without being followed by a reinforcer, if we're considering operant conditioning, the more of those exposures, the more of those trials, the better extinction will be, and the longer that extinction will last. For massing and spacing, we've actually kind of talked about this previously. When we first talked about spontaneous recovery much earlier in the course, we made mention that if you mass a bunch of trials together, if you have many, many, many trials that occur very close together, so let's do a timeline here. And if you have lots and lots of extinction trials that occur very, very close together here, you tend to see a much quicker decrease in responding. So our extinction tends to happen much, much faster. However, with having them occurring so close together like this, we are more prone to having spontaneous recovery if there's a delay. If instead we use spacing, where instead of presenting them all close together like this, maybe we would do a trial here, a trial here, a trial here. If we spread them out a little bit, we're going to see a much slower drop off in that behavior. So the extinction doesn't happen as quickly, but it also means that we're less prone to spontaneous recovery. There is some talk that this can be helpful for things other than just spontaneous recovery, but it has been most studied in terms of spontaneous recovery. So that's what we have the most evidence for. Okay, and then that brings us nicely to our last stage, where many alternations of extinction and rest sessions can get rid of spontaneous recovery. So if we have our graph like this, so we have our acquisition, and then our extinction, and then we see spontaneous recovery, we saw that if we do another delay, so we do another gap here, and we do another exposure, then we see a little bit more spontaneous recovery, but it's not as intense as the first time. And so if we then did it again, we would see less, do it again is less, and again is even less. So many alternations of extinction, so that's this period. Rest are the little gaps in here, so that would be rest, and then extinction, and then rest, extinction, rest, and so on. The more repetitions that you have, the less you're going to see spontaneous recovery. So that one's pretty straightforward as well. If we want to focus on getting rid of renewal, then we want to focus on having lots and lots of different contexts that we could experience extinction in. So we had mentioned that renewal occurs because extinction is very specific to the context in which it is learned. So if you learn extinction only in context B, then if you go into any other context, say you go back to A, extinction won't have applied here. If you go to a new context, context C, extinction is not applying there. So if to try and get rid of renewal, maybe you want to go through extinction, give an extinction process in A, go through extinction in process or in condition C, have extinction happen multiple times in multiple different environments to try and make it more likely for extinction to generalize to other contexts. And maybe it isn't feasible to go through extinction multiple times in multiple places, but maybe you could use some cues that are specifically related to extinction that you could bring to different contexts. For extinction-related cues, this could be as simple as reminding yourself to think back to the therapist's office where you first underwent extinction, and remember that to sort of generalize to this new situation. Or if you were always listening to calming music during your previous extinction trials, then bringing that music with you to new environments could help as well. So having lots of different contexts or bringing some of your cues that you already associated with extinction into new environments can help get that extinction to generalize to new situations. Our last method of enhancing extinction is the idea of using compound stimuli. So by having two elements put together and having that compound stimulus undergoing extinction, it actually makes the extinction stronger and less prone to spontaneous recovery when those elements are tested alone. So, for example, if we looked at a situation where we have a compound stimulus of a light and a tone. So whenever a light and a tone are presented together, during the acquisition phase, maybe the light and the tone tell you that food is coming. During the extinction phase, light and tone would tell you that no food is coming, or that nothing is coming. So during that phase, then when the light and tone occur together, you would see less and less food anticipating responses, like a rat putting their head in a feeder. And then if we were testing with just the elements, so exposure to just a light or exposure to just a tone, we would see less spontaneous recovery than if we were using just a light or just a tone alone from the very beginning. So having a compound stimulus makes the whole process more effective for whatever reason. Now, our last handful of slides are all about the paradoxical rewards effects that we can see when we're looking at sort of reinforcement and then extinction. But these all kind of go together, and I don't want to break them up, and I don't think I can finish them in 10 minutes. So I think what we're going to do is I'm going to cut today's lecture here today. I know in the syllabus it says that we would try and get through chapter 9 this week, but we're going to have probably about a 15-minute clip for chapter 9, and I'll post that next week on Tuesday, in addition to a sort of shorter section of chapter 10 that'll come up on Tuesday as well. So next Tuesday, you'll see 2 shorter videos instead of 1 long video. I just don't want to rush through the last couple of slides of this chapter. I'd rather give it the time it deserves. So we'll bleed over just a little bit into next week. So hopefully you all don't mind. And I will post the quiz that goes along with chapter 9 as soon as we finish that next week as well. So enjoy the rest of your week and have a great weekend. I'll talk to you guys again on Tuesday.